Hello heroes, and welcome to another uncanny episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This video topic was voted on by Patreon supporters. If you would like to cast your own vote in monthly polls and help decide what gets covered on the channel, you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below. The subject for today's story is a man named Nathaniel Essex, who lived in London, England in the 19th century. He was a brilliant biologist, considered by some to be one of the greatest minds of his generation. Others, like Charles Darwin, considered Essex dangerous, a man corrupted by his own obsession with recent evolutionary theories, and the insistence that morality was an unnecessary hindrance to science. He apparently started down this path after his son Adam was born with genetic defects, causing him to pass away at age 4. In 1859, his wife was pregnant with their second child, while Essex was in danger of being expelled by his peers. While Darwin's research was instrumental in pioneering the theory of evolution by natural selection occurring over a multitude of generations, Essex believed that more rapid change was possible. He put forth the idea that due to parcels of hereditary genetic information, humanity held within it the potential for mutation so drastic that it could result in dramatic transformation within 1 or 2 generations. He dubbed these hereditary parcels Essex factors. While presenting his ideas to the Royal Society, he unveiled a crude prototype he'd pieced together from human and animal remains to demonstrate potential mutations. Of course, this led to outrage, with Essex ultimately being ousted from the scientific community. Darwin tried to reason with the man, imploring him to consult a physician and get help. However, Essex decided that if he was going to be branded a monster, then he would simply become one. He desired to abandon his conscience and be completely unhindered by human morality. But not knowing what to do, he retired to the local pub to drown his feelings and observe the shady crowd. It was there that he met a man calling himself Cootie Tremble. He was the leader of a group called the Marauders, who abducted outcasts from society and held them in underground cages. Some captives seemed normal at a glance, like a boy named Daniel who stopped talking after witnessing his parents' murder. Others, however, displayed signs of the kind of mutation that Essex had theorized. The Marauders planned on simply killing and robbing Essex, but the wily scientist convinced them to work for him instead. And so they began delivering their misshapen victims to him so he could continue his experiments. But then one man they tried to abduct turned out to be more than they'd bargained for. Shortly afterwards, Essex was estranged from his wife when she discovered that he'd exhumed the corpse of their son for experimentation. Around the same time, he was approached by a man named N. Saba Nur, who proposed an alliance. Finding himself in need of allies, Essex agreed and presented his work to the mysterious foreigner. He also brought his new ally to the notorious Hellfire Club, where Nur presented his own ideas to the wealthy socialites. When he was dismissed, N. Saba Nur revealed his true form, the terrifying mutant Apocalypse. You see, throughout history, there have been examples of beings born with an extra gene, giving them special powers. Born in ancient Egypt, En-Saba-Nur was one of the earliest examples of this kind of mutant, and formed his worldview around the ideology that the strong would survive while the weak died off. In addition to his mutation making his molecular structure exceptionally adaptable, Apocalypse also discovered technology belonging to the incredibly powerful space gods, the Celestials, which he incorporated into his techno-organic armor. He also used these alien machines to hibernate for long periods of time. After awakening in 19th century London, he encountered and enslaved the Marauders, and from them learned of Nathaniel Essex. Essex, however, was still conflicted and attempted to return to his wife, Rebecca. However, in his absence, their second child had been born prematurely and did not survive. Rebecca was also dying when he arrived, but she could not forgive him for what he'd done. The last word ever spoken by Rebecca Essex was the one she used to describe her husband in her final moments: Sinister. Meanwhile, 2 other mutants mysteriously appeared, time-traveling enemies of Apocalypse from over 100 years in the future, Scott Summers and his wife, Jean. These 2 were captured by Apocalypse, who gave them to Essex for dissection and study. Scott and Jean attempted to reason Essex from his dark path, but Apocalypse offered to free him both from morality and mortality. Essex agreed and thus was genetically altered into a pale-skinned superhuman, and when told to choose a new name, he dubbed himself Mr. Sinister. He soon recognized that what Apocalypse promised was true when he observed a photo of Rebecca and felt no emotions. But despite this, through cold, calculated logic, he realized after seeing the cyborg abominations that had been made of the Marauders that his new master did not share his goals. While Apocalypse intended to force mankind to grow stronger through conflict, Sinister believed that suffering without purpose was useless, and that the key to humanity's apotheosis was through breeding and genetics. And so after he was commanded to engineer a plague to test the population, Sinister released Scott and Jean. Instead of concocting a disease that could potentially deform humanity, Sinister instead created one that would target and weaken Apocalypse specifically. This allowed the 2 time travelers to save the Queen of England from the ancient mutant before returning to their own era. Apocalypse then returned to his slumber, respecting Sinister's fortitude enough not to kill him for his betrayal. Following the death of Charles Darwin in 1882, Sinister moved to New York to continue his work. There, he became an obstetrician under the name Nathan Milbury, which may have been his wife's maiden name. One of his patients was a woman named Amanda Mueller, by some reports a mutant with superhuman longevity. Mueller agreed to participate in Sinister's experiments and was used as a sort of birthing factory. As a result, she experienced several miscarriages and was accused of murdering her own children in utero. The media dubbed her the Black Womb Killer, although testimony from Nathan Milbury allowed her to escape any actual consequences. Nonetheless, her husband Daniel left her, bringing their only surviving child with him. A little bit of a tangent, but it's been speculated that this may have been the same Daniel who was previously held captive by the Marauders and presumably experimented on by Nathaniel Essex. Some publications list his full original name as Daniel Edge, and while this may be accepted now, this seems to have been a misreading of the actual source material. In either event, the boy was freed by Scott and Jean Grey Summers while they were both in 1859. In 1860, Daniel reached New York with a former marauder named Oscar Stamp. In honor of his saviors, Daniel took the surname Summers, and so he may conceivably be Scott Summers' ancestor, as might Amanda Mueller, but this remains unconfirmed. But back to Mr. Sinister, in 1891 he encountered another time-traveling mutant, the shape-shifting Courier. Courier took a female form to investigate Nathan Milbury, but he ended up being captured and studied. Because of this, Sinister successfully endowed himself with Courier's abilities, giving him complete mental control over his entire cellular structure. However, Courier did not come to the past alone, and soon he and Sinister were found by his ally, Gambit. Sinister subsequently made a deal with Gambit, performing a surgery on him which restored his powers to their full potential. I've talked about those events on the channel before, so for more details on Gambit's relationship with Mr. Sinister, as well as more information on the Black Womb, you can check out the video linked in the description. But we will note that while operating on Gambit, Sinister noticed evidence that he had already done so once before, yet another consequence of time travel. Several years later, in 1899, Sinister returned to London to awaken Apocalypse from his hibernation. He infected his would-be master with a techno-organic virus in an attempt to destroy him, but Apocalypse's adaptive molecular structure allowed him to take full control of the virus, using it to his advantage. As a minor note, while the dialogue in the original presentation of the story seems to imply that Apocalypse was infected after being awakened by Sinister, official handbooks have indicated that this was the same virus he'd used to awaken Apocalypse 40 years prior. But regardless of when exactly he was infected, Apocalypse realized that Sinister was an unreliable servant and released him, saying that if they'd met again, it would be as enemies. Sinister fled, and as the 20th century dawned, he traveled the world searching for those whose genetic code contained his so-called Essex factors. By 1907, he'd set up operations in the Canadian wilderness under his original name and recruited a new group of marauders. There, he captured and studied a mutant with incredible healing abilities, one who would later be known as Wolverine. I also have a video detailing his origins on the channel, so check that for more on these events from his perspective. After being freed by his allies, Wolverine attempted to take his revenge on Essex, stabbing him and throwing him out a window, but of course the mad geneticist had already given himself the power to survive such an attack. In 1909, he found Wolverine again and continued to test his healing factor, this time while working at the Ravencroft Institute in New York State. One of the orderlies there was also a mutant, a man named Victor Creed, better known as Sabretooth. With his help, Essex defeated and dissected an actual werewolf, a member of the lycanthropic Russell family. Several years later, in 1915, Sinister met a man named Jacob Shaw and unlocked his latent mutation, endowing Shaw with shape-shifting powers. He also discovered that the apparent mystic, Grigory Rasputin, was another potential mutant. Sinister encouraged Rasputin to mate with women who also possessed Essex factors, and experimented on the unborn children to further increase the odds of mutation. Rasputin was assassinated around the end of 1916, but before dying he mystically transferred pieces of his soul into these children that he might someday return. By 1919, Sinister met a blind mutant, Irene Adler, whose psychic visions gave her knowledge that not even Sinister's mind could fathom. In the 1920s, Essex taught at Oxford University and possibly mentored a young Herbert Edgar Wyndham, today known as the High Evolutionary. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, he was a Hollywood socialite, Nathan Essex. He met a radio comedienne named Faye Livingstone who also possessed the Essex factors. He romanced her to lure her in, but she soon discovered his grotesque experiments. After explaining that her children could be more than human, Sinister imprisoned and studied Livingstone. Perhaps it was a rare moment of humanity, or maybe he simply learned everything he needed to know, but after several weeks of degrading examination, Sinister released her without explanation. During World War II, he worked at the Auschwitz concentration camp alongside Joseph Mengele. There, he would offer young prisoners candy in exchange for drops of their blood, earning him the nickname Nosferatu. He was also able to obtain a blood sample from Namor, the sub-mariner, during a fight with the Nazi super soldier Masterman in 1944. Another mutant he encountered was John Greycrow, a disgraced American soldier with remarkable regenerative powers. Greycrow helped Essex gather more subjects to study, including children. By this point, he'd learned enough to grow a fully formed clone of Namor, dubbed Experiment N2. While the creation of the clone was successful, N2 was ultimately defeated by Namor's ally, Captain America. In the closing days of the war, Sinister's abandoned lab was cleared out by Nick Fury's Howling Commandos and a professor named Truett Hudson, sometimes identified by a pseudonym Andre Thornton. The professor found a journal belonging to Essex which helped accelerate his own research, ultimately culminating in the Weapon X project. On the subject of Black Ops government programs in 1946, Sinister worked again with Amanda Mueller on Project Black Womb, dissecting and studying newborn mutants. As Dr. Milbury, he also funded and oversaw Mueller's Eugenics Information Center in Nevada. By the late 1960s, he had a lab in Vietnam and used that war as a cover to abduct and experiment on people. He still employed John Greycrow, who by this point adopted the uncomfortable alias of Scalp Hunter. In 1968, Sabretooth was hired to investigate the missing people in Saigon, but Sinister dispatched Grey Crow to simply pay him off after killing his employer. At some point, as Nathan Milbury, Sinister also worked at Black Womb's research facility in Alamogordo, New Mexico, alongside Irene Adler, Kurt Marco, Alexander Reiking, and Brian Xavier. As part of a backup plan to ensure his own immortality, Sinister injected his co-workers' children with encoded genetic information. This included Kane Marco, Carter Reiking, Charles Xavier, as well as Jacob Shaw's son, Sebastian. This project was tied to a machine called Cronus, which could activate a backup copy of Mr. Sinister he'd encoded into the genetics of another, allowing him to survive even his own death. Sinister would later see Charles Xavier again while teaching at Oxford University, and he encountered a teenage Gambit when he hired the New Orleans Thieves Guild. Gambit was sent to retrieve Essex's old journal from the Weapon X facility in Canada. However, upon glimpsing the atrocities committed there, he destroyed the book, fearing what it could be used for. Meanwhile, Sinister built an orphanage in Sage, Nebraska, the state home for foundlings. He manipulated the development of children there for decades, during which time he discovered a young Scott Summers and his brother Alex. The Summers brothers had seemingly lost their parents in a plane crash, and Scott had struck his head on the ground while parachuting Alex to safety. Their father and mother, Christopher and Catherine Summers, were actually abducted by aliens, but that's a whole other story. Manipulating events from behind the scenes, Sinisters had the hospitalized Scott drugged to keep him unconscious for longer than necessary. The boys were transferred to his orphanage, and it was arranged for Alex to be adopted first, separating the brothers. Sinister also tested Alex, sending a young man to attack him and threaten his new family. After being pushed hard enough, Alex's mutant power manifested and he unleashed a deadly energy blast on his attacker. Because he could not yet control these powers, Sinister suppressed Alex's ability to use them as well as his memories of that day. At some point, he also grafted a DNA sample from Alex onto a man named Ahmet Abdal, catalyzing his transformation into the living monolith, but again, that is another story. Meanwhile, Sinister was also observing Scott, taking the form of an orphan boy named Nathan to get close. Scott's power to shoot beams of concussive force from his eyes began to emerge, but he had a total lack of control due to his brain injury. At night, Sinister captured and examined Scott, learning that a synthetic ruby quartz was capable of blocking his optic blasts. If you're curious as to how that works, I'm oddly fascinated by this, so let me take a second to explain. It's actually related to the fact that Scott's body naturally generates a psionic energy field, making him immune to his own eye beams. The concussive force that he shoots from his eyes actually comes from another universe. His abilities have sometimes been described as solar-powered, but that's because he takes in ambient energy like sunlight, using it to power the apertures that access the other dimensional particles. When the beams strike his own body, the concussive particles are harmlessly shunted back to their point of origin. This is also why he can stop the beams by closing his eyes. Ruby quartz resonates with the psionic field that his mind generates, and thus wearing glasses made of that material has the same effect as simply closing his eyes. Anyway, Cyclops would have terrible headaches during the day, thinking it was a side effect of his head injury. In truth, they were caused by Mr. Sinister constantly suppressing the memory of his experimentation, as well as postponing the development of his powers. And Sinister also ensured that Scott remained at the orphanage as long as possible. When a couple named Rick and Trish Bogart started the process of adopting Scott, Sinister engineered an accident ensuring that both were killed before he lost his prized subject. However, eventually Scott's power did fully manifest and he ran away from the orphanage. He was subsequently recruited by Charles Xavier and became the first X-Man, Cyclops. Xavier was also mentoring Jean Grey, the other time traveler who Sinister had encountered, and Scott's future wife. After Scott and Xavier recruited several more members, Jean joined the team as Marvel Girl, completing the original X-Men. Sinister observed the group and theorized that the offspring of Scott and Jean would be powerful enough to defeat Apocalypse. Covering his bases, Sinister harvested Jean's DNA and attempted to clone her, but while the copy looked like Jean, it seemed to lack her mutant powers. Then, the real Jean was thought to have died, sacrificing herself after apparently being possessed by an alien entity called the Phoenix Force. In truth, the Phoenix didn't actually inhabit Jean's body, but transformed itself into a copy of her using a piece of her soul, while the real Jean was sealed away. For more details on those events, you can watch my video on the Phoenix linked in the description. The important thing for today is that after destroying itself, or at least that particular incarnation of itself, the Phoenix attempted to return the piece of Jean it had taken, inadvertently sending it to Sinister's clone. Since the clone was now endowed with consciousness, Sinister continued his plan, programming her to fall in love with Scott Summers, implanting false memories of being an airplane pilot, and giving her the name Madeline Pryor, in reference to her prior existence as Jean Grey. Things proceeded from there, with Scott and Madeline meeting, falling for one another, and quickly getting married. And the two indeed had a baby together, Nathan Christopher Summers, who they unknowingly named after Nathaniel Essex. Mr. Sinister also watched these events while posing as an elderly neighbor, Mike Milbury. Meanwhile, at some point, Sinister was also approached by Gambit, whose ability to charge objects with kinetic energy was steadily growing out of control. Sinister performed surgery on him, ensuring that his power stayed at a manageable level. This, of course, is why Mr. Sinister noticed signs of his own handiwork having been done on Gambit's brain when he operated on him decades prior, because Gambit later went back in time and had the younger Sinister undo the process to restore his full potential. But before any of that, he needed to repay his debt and did jobs for Sinister, the first of which was to recruit a new team of marauders. This version included old faces like Grey Crow and Sabretooth, but also new recruits Arclight, Blockbuster, Harpoon, Riptide, Vertigo, Scrambler, and Prism. Meanwhile, the real Jean Grey turned up alive and reunited with Scott. Wanting to stop his plans from being exposed by Jean's telepathy, Sinister dispatched the Marauders to assassinate Madeline Pryor. However, she survived their attack and was checked into a hospital as a Jane Doe. Sinister also discovered that at least some of the Morlocks, the misshapen mutants living in the sewers beneath New York, were either created or manipulated by the Dark Beast, an alternate version of the original X-Man Hank McCoy from the Age of Apocalypse timeline, who had co-opted Sinister's research. Considering this a perversion of his work, Sinister dispatched the Marauders to eliminate the Morlocks, tasking Gambit with tracking their targets underground. Gambit, of course, was not told why he was leading them to the Morlocks, and by the time he figured it out, it was too late to stop the ensuing mutant massacre. While these actions drew the attention of the X-Men and other heroes, Sinister had already harvested genetic material from each of the Marauders, and so any who fell in battle could be cloned and replaced. Sinister also sent Grey Crow and the others to finish the job they'd started by killing Madeline Pryor in the hospital, but she was saved by the X-Men. He did succeed in abducting her baby Nathan, but soon an Inferno would ignite that changed everything. As part of his demonic invasion of New York, Nastir, the ruler of the limbo dimension known as Other Place, corrupted Madeline, awaking her latent powers and transforming her into the villainous Goblin Queen. The demon then brought Pryor to meet Mr. Sinister, and she learned the truth of her origins. Sinister tried to hold the Goblin Queen captive, but she broke free and reclaimed her son. There's definitely a lot more that could be said about the Inferno, but the demonic invasion was ultimately repelled, and the Goblin Queen was defeated by the X-Men. Nathan Christopher Summers was saved and reunited with his father. But soon after, the heroic mutants were attacked by Mr. Sinister himself. Scott learned the truth about how he'd been tormented by Sinister as a child, and in the end he overcame his mental blocks when Jean was threatened, using his optic blast to completely obliterate their enemy. Of course, Sinister survived and would continue to battle the X-Men for years to come. He also put together another team of mutant enforcers, the Nasty Boys. Sinister still planned on using Nathan against his former master, but Apocalypse countered this by infecting the child with his techno-organic virus. In order to survive, Nathan was sent to the 40th century where the virus could be treated. And a much older Nathan later returned to the modern day as the grizzled freedom fighter Cable. While Cable did indeed become a staunch enemy of Apocalypse, the techno-organic virus effectively nerfed what would have been vast telepathic and telekinetic powers, since he was forced to constantly use his abilities to prevent the virus from consuming his body. As such, Cable tended to rely on weapons and technology rather than his mutant powers. But back to Mr. Sinister, as I mentioned, he continued to be an enemy of the X-Men for years, and at some point during this he began using cloning technology on himself. In fact, he duplicated himself enough that eventually he started to consider his clones a species unto themselves. But because these copies still held the potential for random mutation, one of them emerged with the mutant gene. And so while Charles Xavier and Magneto were preparing to build their own mutant nation, they enlisted this Sinister to create a comprehensive database of all mutant DNA so that any dead mutants could be resurrected. Exactly when this conversation happened in the overall timeline is ambiguous and ultimately difficult to place, but I guess it's not that important. Either way, in the end, this is why Mr. Sinister is included in the mutant population of Krakoa, even though Nathaniel Essex was originally human. Anyway, there's probably a lot more that could be said about Mr. Sinister, and characters like Alex Summers, Madeline Pryor, and Cable could definitely use videos of their own, but that's all I've got for you this week. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for more marvelous content. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!